This is interesting. So this is actually the meatier part. We get to talk about GMFA, its history, and a few questions on the past, present, and the future of HIV. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and what is your connection to GMFA, essentially. A bit about yourself. First one on my screen is Sean. So Sean, would you like to introduce yourself? And yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I'm Sean Cook. I was a volunteer for GMFA, well, officially since the year 2000, when I could first officially start doing campaigns. Unofficially, I started a little while before that, before women and heterosexuals were allowed to be members of GMFA. So I was a little bit under the radar to begin with. But yeah, I worked on, I'm a designer, and I worked on a number of campaigns for the mass media group over a number of years.
Matthew, next, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Matthew Hodson. I joined GMFA in 1998, that's 9. Initially as a project administrative support. Then we became project managers fairly shortly after that. And then I worked my way up the ranks by people leaving, and so became head of operations and eventually chief executive. And I left GMFA or HERO as it was by then, in 2016.
Mark, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. It's great. And first of all, I'm just taking in seeing all these wonderful people for years. It's great to see you. I'm Mark Thompson. I'm currently the director of the Love Tank and co-founder of Prepster. My connection to GMFA goes back to 1994, when I first seen the work, but also I was the first project manager of Big Up, which GMFA was a really great supporter of in the early days, and Martin Dockrell helped to get started. So that was my initial connection. And I've worked on and off with GMFA over the years. And most recently, I worked to project manage and develop the Me, Him, Us campaign and some of the Undetectables videos. So it's really lovely to be here.
Nick, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hello. As you said, Mark, it's really nice to see some of these faces, these lovely young faces. I joined, I thought it was 93, but I'm sure it was old. I'm sure it was more than a year old when I joined. 93, maybe early 94. I was a volunteer in Query, which was our research arm. I then did some training the trainer stuff. I then was on the board of directors for a while, and then I became employed as head of programs. I think it was head of programs or head of operations, something like that. Worked with Mark, recruited the whippersnappers, Matthew and Carrie, part of the decision making. Should we let Sean officially join or not? I don't know. Is it right or wrong? So part of lots of these discussions have gone on. So really nice to have the intro, Ian, and to hear what happened after I hadn't stopped having anything to do with it in 2006. So really great to hear what happened after that halfway point.
And Carrie.
Great. Hi, my name is Kerry James. I joined GMFA in 2002, about a week before the 10th anniversary party, which was a great time. To join for sure. My first remit was doing the website and doing the newsletter, which then was called Fuck Sheet, which was just like a black and white newsletter, which later became FS Magazine. I was at GMFA for just under 10 years. And during that time, we developed Fuck Sheet, and we launched several different campaigns and interventions, and also talked Ben Cohen, rugby player Ben Cohen, to give us his jockstrap for the auction at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which is probably one of my biggest claims to fame. And I'm glad to see Mark and Nick have like official glasses of GMFA alumni. I'm going to have to get some of those. But yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for being part of this panel. So what we're going to do is I have some questions. I'm just going to have a chat. You've all been sent some of them before, so you've got time to think about stuff. But I may divulge from them. It depends on what you say. So the first question is, Did GMFA really have an impact in the fight against AIDS? I'm going to ask you first, Matthew. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite hard now to recall quite how bad things were for gay men. I mean, GMFA was founded in just, what, 4 years after Section 28 was introduced. And so I think now we're so used to so much gay media and gay representation that we forget what it was like before people could just Google something. There was no internet back then. And so actually those images of gay sex and positive images of gay sex and positive discussion of gay sex was really groundbreaking. And I think that was why there was so much anger about the way that HIV prevention funds were being allocated, was because there was nothing for gay men to grasp. There was nothing for them to get hold of. You know, we were having our resources thrown out of libraries at the time because of Section 28. And so then there was a group of angry gay men saying, no, actually gay sex is good and gay men's health matters. And I think that we made that point very well, and it took a long time. And I think sometimes it's easy for other organizations perhaps whitewash a bit of their history and pretend that they were better at serving gay men at the time than they were. But if it hadn't been for gay men, my opinion is, if it hadn't been for gay men fighting AIDS, gay men would have been left off the agenda. And as they were, the group with by far the highest number of infections taking place within the UK at the time, that was sending out a very powerful message that our lives didn't matter. And I think what GMFA accomplished was the message that our lives did matter and that we should be resourced, our health mattered.
I have to unmute myself. Mark, I'd like to hear what you think.
I mean, absolutely it did. And I think, Matthew kicks off a really good point about where we were at the time and everything that was happening around us as well. And I think that what GMFA certainly did, yes, it had an impact. I mean, I think, sadly, as the years went on, we continued to be infected. We continued to reach record numbers for a good 10, 15 years after GMFA was founded. So there was lots of other factors taking place. But number one, yes, our lives started to matter and we started to take notice. We started to challenge government. Prior to that, I don't recall an organization or a movement as powerful or as radical as that. And it was really audacious and unapologetic. And I think that's what was really important for me. But what really struck me about when we look back on it, it was wonderful seeing the archive. GMFA didn't just change where we were, it changed the language and how we talk about sex and how we do health promotion. And even today, we're still doing the things that GMFA did then, which is about being radical, thanks to Sian's design, but it also came directly from community. And the final thing I want to say, I think what GMFA really did really well was to look at the lives of positive men. So positive men were valued, we were having sex, and GMFA were acknowledging that, and we're doing so much around not just stigma in the community, but this internalized stigma we were feeling then. So I think that's where it had some of its biggest impacts.
Nick, as somebody who has been in the organization from near the beginning, what's your thoughts?
For me, I think most of us here have taken the GMFA coin at some point. I think one of the things we really need to realize is GMFA is a volunteer-led organization, and that meant we were doing something very different and very special. So those of us who were employed, we weren't supposed to, we weren't really making the decisions. We were helping volunteers come up with brilliant campaigns, be the models, use the words, find out what would make a difference for them. And I think that's one of the key things to think about is at the time we were fighting to keep ourselves alive, keep our lovers alive, keep our friends alive. So it's very centered. Often when we think about health promotion, it's about helping people other than us. But what we were doing was trying to stay alive, trying to stop the people around us dying. So therefore, the anger that Matthew has mentioned, the passion and the kind of work that Mark said, I think we did something very radical, and that's kind of a bit hard for people to understand now when it was such a difficult and violent time. And we talked about things that thinking about sex positivity, about shame, about self-esteem, about internalized homophobia. We might not have been using those words, but that was the drive for what we were trying to do, was to reduce some of the impact that society had on, as I say, us, our lovers, our friends, the people around us in our peer group. The first things that Peter Scott used to talk about was the each one teach one model, which was kind of a development model, I think, isn't it? A kind of a community development model. But instead of, what was it? Each one teach one. Was it nag one shag one, or
nag one was
shag one nag one? So each one teach one turned into nag one shag one. So it was about educating the people we were fucking and our friends and the people they were fucking. So these closed circles of influence. And I mean, that's insanely radical.
I mean, really, I didn't know that. I know the approach because it's been said to me, but I didn't know that was the main driver behind it, is essentially teach somebody who you're having sex with. Interesting. Sean, as somebody from like an outside perspective, what's your thoughts on kind of like the history of GMFA, especially from the beginning?
Yeah, I suppose also building on what Nick has just said about it being volunteer-led, I think what it showed is that you could be a radical activist outside the mainstream organisation, but in fact, the product, what we put out, was highly professional in what it was looking like. So it could directly compete with the type of advertising that was out there in the gay press or in the clubs or whatever. We had stuff that fitted, that looked like club flyers or looked like, an ad for a porn magazine or whatever it was, something that fitted within that environment. And that was produced by volunteers. Nobody was, as you mentioned, we had professional photographers and models giving their time. So we could make the stuff look good and look really credible with the audience. It wasn't a sort of, activist, let's make a poster out of pasta and macaroni or something, and kind of, it all looked very amateurish and hand done. This was professional work that we were aiming to do on virtually no budget at all. And I think, if anything, GMFA did that really well. It really competed in that environment.
Carrie, as somebody who came in but 10 years into the charity, what's your thoughts?
Yes. So, I mean, I came in after like the combination therapy had started. So things were starting to transform, right? But they were still, the treatments were still, very difficult for some people to tolerate. People were dying on a regular basis, even within our volunteer group. So it's still a very urgent time, I think. And I think one of the great things about GMFA is it not only like pushed itself forward, but I really do think it pushed the HIV response in the UK forward as well. I mean, it's kind of frankness and honesty in the way that it talked to gay men, the way that we talked to each other, the way that it was using, very frank language and sometimes challenging language, that definitely moved the dial on how other organizations with much more funding were also doing the work that they were doing. And I think in the early 2000s, I mean, gay sex was still like a political statement, right? It was still like a protest, and especially within not a protest as much as a celebration, I suppose. Do you know what I mean? And I think that was something that we always kind of felt, that this was a right that we had, that no one had the right to tell us that we didn't have, and we were going to celebrate it, we were going to talk about it, and we were going to be honest about it. And I do think that even from the 2000s moving into the next era, that really did push the whole agenda in the UK along. Thanks.
So, I mean, thinking about the history that GMFA has had and the impact that it's had, this question to all of you, what do you think the perception of HIV has changed over the last 30 years? Like, what do you think has been the biggest catalyst for change? Let's go back to Matthew.
Well, I mean, over the last 30 years, I think we'd have to say effective treatment has been the biggest change. I mean, we had effective treatment by the time that I joined GMFA. We had effective treatment by the time that I was diagnosed, although I do recall when I was diagnosed, it wasn't like, oh, you're going to live a full lifespan. It was like, we've got something that's going to work, but, you know, still it was like, kind of count your years. And I was diagnosed when I was 30, and it was like, oh, you've got maybe 15, maybe 20 years. And it was like, well, that's quite a lot of time, but it's, you know, it was, I was kind of, okay, I'm going to piece out my life accordingly. And it's only since that we've discovered actually how effective it is, and we've got so much better at dosing, and so that the side effects are less. I mean, obviously, U equals U is an incredibly important thing, and I think that's really had an impact on the way we talk about HIV, and I think it's really supported people in coming out and being open about their HIV status. But if you're talking about what's changed in the 30 years, it's got to be that we had treatment. And I think, you know, with Mark and with Nick and Sean in particular, I mean, you know, our generation, we just knew a lot of people who died. And like, kind of, sometimes I talk about that, and I'm talking about it with younger people, and people are like, well, that must have been extraordinary. But I think for all of us, you know, I mean, well, you know, I know Mark got diagnosed very, very early on, kind of as a kind of young gay person, but it was like, I didn't know anything different. That's what the gay scene was, as far as I was concerned. It was a scene where people often had really short lives, and that's what we were all coping with. And it wasn't all grim, because we had laughter and fun and fellowship within that, but it was a challenging time to live through.
Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, thank you, Matthew, for that. And I think, you know, clearly treatment, and then obviously treatment as prevention, and then PrEP has completely, totally changed the landscape. And I think there's an absence a little bit around HIV now in our communities. You know, we live well, we do okay, we survived, and we survived. But I think what hasn't changed is the impact it has on an individual. And these are things we still need to talk about. There is still that tail that leads from that time, all of that horror, all of the fear that we had. It continues to today, and there are still young people being diagnosed today who know that they can get on treatment. They'll know they'll have a really good lifespan. They know they won't pass on HIV. They can have children, but they're still holding on to many of the things that I held on to when I was diagnosed. Matthew probably experienced himself as well. So there's so much there which remains.
Nick, you haven't been in the kind of bubble for quite some time.
No, I spent lots of years not really thinking about gay sex, important stuff I was having occasionally. But I was in a more or less monogamous relationship until I think 2016. So not being involved in the sector, being in a monogamous relationship, and then relaunching as a single man in the kind of 2017 gay world, where people casually mention on PrEP or U equals U or pause treatment, you know, and that was it. There was nothing else to talk about. So radically having sex with men whom it was just not an issue, not something to talk about. I mean, sometimes it was worrying because there were people that didn't seem to know the things they should be talking about and to know what the parameters were. So I kind of resisted the nag one, shag one, but not very successful. I think once it's in you, it's, you know, you've got it forever. So, you know, when there's a younger guys I was maybe having sex with, then maybe I'd get my teacher's hat back on, or, you know, get my tips from the AS class or the AS class. We used to pronounce it in different ways depending on where we were from the country, AS class or AS class. Get my tips back from there to help people negotiate really the sex they wanted without just giving in to somebody else's. So that idea that treatment could so radically change people's approach to sex was incredible, and it was really interesting. So for me, coming, having been away from it and seeing what exists now and just how different that is. I don't know where people get education from. I don't know where people would understand any of this from now, but that's a very different question and not one you asked.
I mean, we'll probably get into it in a while, because HIV has definitely changed, as the way people are getting education has completely changed. Carrie, as somebody stepped outside of the bubble as well, like, what's your thoughts? You're on mute, Carrie.
Has to happen at least once, if I presume. I mean, it's unrecognizable, right, in many, many ways. But I think, like Mark has said, it's parts of it are very recognizable still. A lot of the stigma that's around HIV is still very much around, a lot of the misinformation. But I mean, did we even think in 2002 when I started that in 20 years we'd be talking about 0 new infections of HIV? I mean, how many years did we all work our butts off and just kept on seeing the numbers rise and rise and rise? And that 1 year when it finally did fall off the cliff because of PrEP, because of same-day test and treat at Dean Street, because of all the new testing technologies, it was an incredible feeling to have worked in the sector, even for part of that, right? And I think it's something that all of us can be proud of, that we worked, and obviously, you guys still work in a sector that actually did that. That's a huge accomplishment. And community action, taking, amplifying the voice of real gay men in the UK were absolutely vital to that. We wouldn't be at the place that we are now if that didn't happen. And
Sean, you've pretty much been involved in HIV over the last 30 years, and you even run your own blog and Instagram account where you share a lot of the campaigns. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I suppose it's all pretty much been said about treatment, but I would like just to emphasize from an outside point of view, just the shift in perception of, gayness generally, and how far we've traveled from, like Matthew said, clause 28, when all of this started, working within all that really tight confines, and so much prejudice, so much media prejudice, so much homophobia. And look how far we've traveled, now we've obviously got gay marriage, we've got, sort of it being acknowledged everywhere. I teach in a university where it is so a non-issue with students. As you said, they don't even think about it in terms of gender, sexuality, everything's just, whatever, it really is, and that's not to say there isn't still need for sex education and, sort of to deal with a lot of issues. But I think, just the societal norms have changed immensely in the past 30 years. And I think, I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but I think HIV did play a role in that in some way.
We're looking at 30 years of, it's over 30 years of innovation's been created. What sexual health innovation or campaign do you think had the greatest impact in your lifetime, whether that is part of GMFA or outside of GMFA? Mark.
Gosh, greatest impact. That's massive. Yeah. Do you know what? It kind of goes without saying. For me, there's a few. The greatest impact was not GMFA. It was the government. It was the Don't Die of Ignorance. And the reason I'm saying that, because it was boom, and it was like, a few months after I was diagnosed, it had a huge impact on me and all the rest of it. But what GMFA did was to counter that. So there's so much work the rock hard penis with somebody's arse about to set on will stick with me forever. That was probably one of the most impactful, because it was in complete opposition to what the HEA were putting out, what THT were putting out, what anybody was doing. And those two completely opposing campaigns for a young gay man at that time, seeing it in the early stage of his diagnosis, was so powerful for me, and really made me kind of feel, the second one from GMFA made me feel sex positive. I can have this sex. This is okay to do that. And it wasn't just the imagery, it was the language that was used. Seeing stuff which said fuck, which said dick, which said cock. And I remember having conversations with the team, with Jamie sometimes, and the team about, do we say cock and arse to black men? Is there a difference? Do we say dick? Just all of that sort of stuff was amazing. But I would say dick going into arse was probably most
Matthew?
Yeah, I remember when I was at university and there was one of those HEA campaigns, and I had to white men, very kind of Calvin Klein model type thing. And they were sort of smirking at each other in black and white, in moody black and white, saying, we don't have safer sex just because it's safer. And I was like, why the fuck do you then? I mean, well, what's the point? I really don't get it. And that was the kind of government-approved advert that was coming out at the time. It was like, kind of, we don't really want to talk about gay sex, so we'll just like kind of make it something moody and maybe a little bit spiritual. But, you know, GMFA was there with their cocks going into arses, and it's like, yeah, that's what I remember. That's more important when you're talking about how HIV is transmitted than looking at each other in a moody way. In response to your question, I mean, I think Mark's right, and I think, you know, the Don't Die of Ignorance campaign kind of gets a bit of a bad press, because I think also at the time, I mean, you've got to remember the environment and the fact that our government actually said, we do want to talk about this. We want to get a national conversation going. And I think it succeeded in that. And it was very well resourced. I mean, I remember we would think, oh my God, if we just had, you know, one, you know, kind of 0.001% of that budget, it would have been amazing, because it was TV adverts, it was posters, it was a leaflet through every door in the country. I mean, you know, we've not seen a campaign like it since. So I mean, I think it's great that we actually did something where we really showed America that, you know, we took this seriously, whereas America was ignoring it for ages. But I think something, it's not just GMFA, but I think GMFA led on this, was saying it's about working with people who may be at risk of acquiring HIV to see what we can do to mitigate their risk. And that may be condoms, but it may not be condoms, because it may be other kinds of sex. It may be you just do oral sex, or you just masturbate, or you just, you know, do other things. And sometimes it may be things which have some risk but carry less risk. And because we were having that conversation, we started to talk about viral load in 2002, which is years before anyone was talking about U equals U. And we started to talk about other harm reduction methods. And actually out of that kind of grew this kind of understanding that, you know, there was going to be a number of different ways that you could prevent HIV being transmitted. And it wasn't a question of one being morally better than the others. It was about, well, you know, what we want is to prevent transmission, and we don't really care how we do that. And I think a part of what we were doing right from the early days, when I started working at GMFA, Gay Men Fighting AIDS, I was their positive campaigns group project manager. And we did campaigns which were developed by men living with HIV. And there was, some of them were for men living with HIV, and some of it was about, you know, kind of make sure you're taking your pills properly, or, you know, kind of access support. But a lot of it was like, this is the kind of sex we can have. This is the kind of sex we enjoy. This is some ways you can reduce the sex, the risk of passing on the virus, you know, and also kind of talking about, sometimes we might have sex with other positive men, and we may choose not to use condoms. And you know what? That's your choice. It was about choice, because a lot of the other campaigns were kind of about telling people what to do. It was pronouncements from on high. It was very paternalistic. You should do this. And the people who are saying you should do this weren't part of the group of the people who were being told what to do. They were saying, I am a heterosexual scientist, and I'm telling gay men that they need to have sex in this way. And I think that permission giving, that kind of recognizing that there wasn't going to be any magic bullet, that we needed to have a multifaceted approach, actually is what ended up working. That's what succeeds. As with treatment, it was a combination approach that finally did it.
Sian?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the tombstones and icebergs, you have to say, just because it was everywhere, so it was bound to have impact. And if that impact was to annoy people or make people angry or whatever, that was still impact, and that was still useful in a way. I suppose for me, I think for GMFA, I would say the Heath Project, when you actually just look at the sheer figures of the number of condoms given away on Hampstead Heath over any of those key years, I mean, it was thousands. It was just really quite shocking. And I think that's where GMFA was quite innovative. And it was one of the projects that really drew me to the organisation, because this was about something being designed. We would now call it service design or something. So it wasn't just like a campaign, but it was giving people the tools for behaviour change. It wasn't just telling them to change their behaviour, but acknowledging what the barriers to the behaviour change might be and how we could make it easier for people. So if somebody actually putting a condom into your hand, along with a few racy postcards or whatever, you know, actually got you to take the condom and use it. And then people even filled out a sexual health survey afterwards and posted it back. You know, I mean, that's just an innovative bit of what we would call service design these days, where you involve the community, you listen to your audience, all of that kind of good practice. But GMFA were doing that instinctively much earlier than a lot of other people. So I think for me, that must have made an impact on the people who went to Hampstead Heath and got handed a safe sex pack.
Nick?
This is so great talking about these projects. It's really good fun. So I want to answer this question in two ways. One, the fact you're asking about impact is really important, because we're always evidence-based. And I think that's one of the really key things to think about right from the beginning. We would work with researchers to find out what worked. We would test. We talked about what does evidence mean. We talked about randomized control trials and learned the language. We taught the language of evidence to volunteers to help them deal with making decisions. And we looked at research papers that said things that are not surprising now, but thinking now, the think that the men that have most sex are more likely to be at risk or most likely to pass on HIV. You think, well, duh, but the evidence was there, so that's what we focus on. So we followed evidence where it was strong, and we taught our community to understand evidence and impact. So I think it's a really useful question you're asking. Yeah, so that's not the answer. Have I got time for an answer as well?
Yeah,
There's something about, it's not a campaign, but I think there's something about the community building aspect of what the collective, all these things did by being where sex was happening, by showing men, yes, we respect what we're doing, by reflecting the community back, not just having those two white muscular hot models that Matthew talked about in his campaign. Although we weren't short of hot models once Carrie came in with all his contact and made FS the glossiest it was. But it was sexy in lots of ways. There was campaigns that we nicknamed chunks in trunks, because it was like bigger guys in pants rather than just one type of muscular guy. So I think we went for diversity. Looking back, I'm not sure we hit all the diversity markers, but we tried to do the diversity, as I said, because we were looking at us, our lovers, our friends, and they didn't all look like Calvin Klein models. Some of them were fatter, some of them were thinner. They weren't all gorgeous. They were older, they were young. So we tried to make sure we reflected the community back to them to say, this is your sex, this is what you, and that I think built community. So I think that's it's not really an answer to your question. I don't think I ever do answer your question. Carrie, you have a go. You say something. Remember what we asked. You say something that makes it sound like we're paying attention.
Well, I think I agree with Matthew. I think the harm reduction stuff in in those early days was so groundbreaking, really. And it was really the beginning of what became like a U equals U movement, right? We were talking about people, how to minimize your risk, and that kind of evolved. And I think I can't remember precisely, but I'm sure around 2010, we were starting to talk about the impact of treatment on infectiousness way before anybody else was. So I think, and GMFA was able to do that because we were GMFA and we weren't THT, right? And we could make the decision to say what we thought needed to be said in a way that other people were too afraid to do. And I think that was super powerful. But maybe just one other thing. I mean, I do think like the work Ian and that Liam, you guys have done with FS Magazine has been just incredible. And it's had, you know, it's lasted for all of these years, and it's really evolved and changed according to the environment and according to the needs of the men who read it. And I think that has had such a great impact. But even when I was editor, I remember once I went to, I think it was like 2007, I went to Brazil, and I was on the beach in Rio, in Ipanema, and there were some boys came down and sat down next to me, and they were giggling and looking at some magazine or whatever and talking in Portuguese. And I looked over, and they were reading FS Magazine, which was kind of incredible. So they must have come from London, and they were reading one of the cheeky FS features that we used to do back then. And I just thought, you know, that little magazine that we're making in that kind of upstairs room in Brixton has made it all the way to Ipanema Beach and is helping some people here. So I think, I mean, kind of kudos to you guys for the way that it's developed over time. But I think, you know, that's the kind of reach that interventions can have like that. When you have something that's kept and passed around, I mean, that's like gold standard of, you know, comms and health promotion. Thanks.
Absolutely. Mark, you want to say something?
Yeah, I did actually. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for those reflections. I mean, so many moments. Just a couple of quick things. I mean, Nick, you mentioned engaging in being evidence-based, but what I think is really important, and I hope the archive picks up, was the way that GMFA also engaged in research and encouraged that research. You know, so working really closely with Sigma, doing the gay men's sex survey, you know, making sure that and it wasn't just about our sex lives, it was about our lives and our wants and our needs. And so much amazing stuff came. So that link there to be able to talk about viral load really early on, it was because we were talking to NAT at the time. We were all in the same building. So there's this beautiful ecosystem, which we'll probably talk about later, is kind of missing, but that ecosystem was, we didn't even call it the sector. That just didn't fit. And Sean, I just want you to sort of reflect back when you talked about the Heath project. I think we should all be so proud, because that is now standard practice in a HIV prevention program, something that GMFA said, you know what, we're going to get out, get condoms and lubes into the places where men are fucking. People are now paying for that to happen in the Heath, in saunas. So that alone is part of an amazing part of our history. Sorry, I'm stuck. This is fantastic.
No, I think it's interesting as well. It's interesting to hear from all your perspective. I mean, I came in at a much later stage into the organization. I mean, I was, what, 8 years old when GMFA was created. So like all the early day stuff is way over my head. I didn't see the Tombstone adverts. I wasn't around for any of that. First time I ever saw a HIV advert was when I came to London, and it was the, I don't know who produced it. It was the bus with the 1 in 12 people are living with HIV. I don't know if you remember that. I think it was a THT advert. And it scared the life out of me. It was actually did what it shouldn't have done, because I had no back history or education around HIV, sexual health. And that's the first thing I saw. So when I went to the pub later on that night, I started looking around, and you start stigmatizing people. So it didn't do what it was supposed to do. And that's my very first experience of actually seeing a HIV advert, because in Ireland, I grew up in a small little town in the middle of Ireland. It didn't exist. So it wasn't until I came to London in 2006, I think it was, for the first time. And yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting in my own personal journey. But it's also really interesting to hear these stories about the early days. Like I didn't know that wasn't a standard practice to hand out condoms in the Hampstead Heath. Like crazy. You think about it now. That sounds like that's what you should be doing.
It was a fight to do it in. I think this is all of the other thing. It wasn't like at first somebody came to us and said, "Oh, we've got this really great idea. Do you want some money to do it?" We raised money to then get teams of volunteers out, and it grew. And as I just popped in the chat to the panelists, we didn't just have teams of people giving out the heath and collecting surveys, as Sean hilariously reminded us, but teams that would go the next morning to pick up the used condoms and all the discarded paper, because otherwise the Hampstead Heath users and the local population would complain, and then that wouldn't put us in good reputation with who we needed to support us to eventually get funding. So it wasn't just those fun bits, but a volunteer job picking up all the used condoms from the heath. I mean, if there are any people on the actually attending this that did any of this, more kudos to you than, and then lots of the jobs we had people doing.
We're going to try and finish this up in about 15 minutes. I want to kind of wrap this up at about 8 o'clock. But the next question I kind of had for you is, based on all those conversations we just had, what do you think is missing from sexual health and HIV prevention today? Matthew.
I mean, I think I would start by acknowledging that actually, in terms of gay men, we're doing really well in terms of HIV prevention. So I think we've got to be honest about that. That actually, I think the areas of greatest need are different. I think I would want to be looking at kind of segmentation of the populations. Because obviously what we're not seeing is an even spread of kind of effective prevention. I think women are very poorly served, heterosexual men are very poorly served. Migrant communities, in particular, people with insecure migration status, are incredibly poorly served. And so if I was kind of like talking about, well, where's the urgent need now? Those are going to be much bigger priorities. We're looking at kind of opt-out testing in emergency departments. We're looking at perhaps kind of trying to encourage GPs to ensure that everyone who registers gets tested. These are kind of the urgent struggles in terms of HIV prevention within the UK. And also just picking up on something that was said earlier on about kind of when we started to see those numbers go down. We started to see those numbers go down in about 2015, I think it was. But actually, the underlying rate of acquisition had started to go down about 3 years earlier. It was before PrEP. PrEP sped that process up, and PrEP is an incredibly valuable tool because it meant that everyone could potentially take control of their sexual health. But actually what had happened was the number of infections had started to reduce as a result of more people testing and more people being on treatment and being undetectable. And that's why tackling stigma is so incredibly important. In terms of what the priorities now, I think we've got to look at the segmentation of the populations and populations that aren't being served, but also we've got to continue that work of tackling stigma, because that is the barrier to testing, that is the barrier to accessing services. And those barriers persist across all of the demographic groups. So I think GMFA was kind of a major force in that, but I think there's, when you say, well, what hasn't been done? Look at the data on stigma. The data on stigma is still really galling. There's still so much commonly held prejudice against people living with HIV. I'm always a little bit concerned when people say zero stigma, because I'm like, well, yeah, we haven't really succeeded on zero racism or zero misogyny yet either. But let's keep the goal in sight and all of that. But we do need to tackle stigma, because that is going to be absolutely vital if we are going to see zero new infections.
Mark, thoughts?
I mean, I echo everything Matthew said around HIV prevention. So I'm going to shift it a little bit, and I'm going to focus, around gay men and sexual health. And I think what's missing is sex and sexiness and fucking and dick and arse. I think these are the things that are missing. How we have sex, that's what's missing from a lot of our sexual health promotion right now. We've gone back to HEA, right? And so it's the medicalization. So it's very much around HIV, it's test, and treat, or get on PrEP. And once you've done that, that's it. So there's very little conversation about how we have sex, how we form relationships. What if you're into the kink scene? What if what if you're gender fluid? All of these different things. What it means to be a gay man has changed significantly as well. Okay, so for me, when I look out at the landscape, I don't see anything as radical, as archaic, as anarchic, as GMFA were doing at the time. You know, so if I flip through the gay press, there was nothing in the gay press, for starters, about our sexual health at all. That's completely absent. So we have to rely on social media. Very often there are small rabid organisations rabbiting around doing that kind of radical work. I'm really proud to say that the Love Tank continues to push that work forward. And even last week, we just choked in the office. We feel like the GMFA of 2023. And I'm really proud to be able to continue doing that. But I think sex, freakiness, and talking about us as we are and live our lives, not this kind of heteronormative, we've all got gay marriage now, we don't fuck anymore, you know, we've all settled down and we've got PrEP. And yeah, so that's missing for me, big time.
How do we put sex back into sexual health in a modern era where censorship is at every turn?
We just keep pushing a button. I mean, censorship was at the turn in the 1980s and 1990s, right? I mean, yes, we've got to battle with social media and tech firms, but we found a way around it before. And I love that, you know, that nag one, shag one idea, that play it forward. Our community are ready to listen. We have to give them the tools and the language and the resources to do so, in the same way that Nick, Peter Scott, Martin Dockrell, all the guys did it back then. We have the tools. We just need to make sure we're passing it on.
Nick, do you have any thoughts on this?
I have no idea. I think Matthew's covered what needs to happen in terms of HIV, and Mark's talked about what putting the sex back, which I agree with both. Well, it's new to me what Matthew's saying. I'm so away from this, but I have a counselling therapy practice and I see private clients. Most of my clients are actually straight men, interestingly, but the gay men I do see, and some of the gay men kind of our ages, there's still trauma there, there's still hurt, there's still a need for community, for understanding, for love, for care, for respect. Some of the things we were building, we're trying to talk about then at GMFA, I think we still need. We're still missing kindness, we're still missing ways of connecting. I don't think that's right. HIV prevention, which is your question, but yeah, determined not to answer any of the questions.
Carrie, any thoughts on that, Carrie?
I don't know if I have anything more to add. I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I think the thing to really obviously recognize is we're in a much different place in terms of communication and how people receive and share communication than we ever were 30 years ago, right? And the kind of, you know, social media and people having their own channels and having their own voices has completely changed the way that, you know, norms are established and messages are translated. And maybe some parts of HIV prevention needs to be a little bit more aware of how to make the most of those sorts of things. I think some people do it really well. I think some people really don't. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's such a different situation as it was even 20 years ago as well. You know, it's not, it used to be like GMFA was always kind of a two-way conversation, but it was very much speaking out. And now the conversation is just as much about what's happening, you know, with an interaction than what it is on a billboard or in a magazine or, you know, even in an ad on a website. Thanks.
Sean, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't think I have much to add in terms of the priorities. I think it's already been said, but I would just want to get in to applaud some of the work, certainly in terms of design and communication work that Crepster do in terms of the visual look of their materials, and also the work that Mark's doing through like Bow magazine for showing positive images of positive people and showing the diversity of opinions and needs of that community as well, and making that a reality, because I think that those voices have been missing for a long time.
I do actually have a question. There's two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. But this question is, you know, with all the wonderful scientific advancements over the last years, has it kind of overshadowed people living with HIV? Have people become less visible over the last 5 years? And like the second part of that question is, how do we put people living with HIV front and center again? Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I'll say something, I guess. I mean, we have a very diverse media landscape now, and social media obviously can change things a lot. I would say that in some ways, I think people living with HIV are more visible now because there are more platforms for us to be visible on. And I think there are people, I include, Mark is is an extraordinary figurehead, I think, for people living with HIV. I saw that Tom Hayes is here today, and he has also been an extraordinary figurehead for people living with HIV. We have people in the media. I mean, there's usually one queen on each season of RuPaul's Drag Race who comes out about living with HIV. I really wish they wouldn't play the sad music when they do that, because I think there's so much to celebrate about how far we've come in terms of our ability to treat HIV. And I really would love to hear some kind of stirring, kind of courageous music underneath it instead, because actually, I feel that what I try and share about living with HIV is it isn't the most important thing. It's something which is a part of me, but it doesn't define me. And I get on and I do other things with my life. And I think that's the important stigma busting message to share. So no more sad music, please. Let's just kind of really talk about what the challenges that remain, talk about ensuring that everyone can test, and especially talking about treatment access, and particularly if we're talking about it on a global level, where we are still nowhere near where we should be by now, more than 27 years since we've had effective HIV treatment, and still more than 25% of people living with HIV don't have access to it. I mean, this is the thing that drives me. Yeah.
Mark, as somebody who is running a magazine that features people living with HIV, what's your thoughts? What would you like to see more from the team?
I mean, I think that was exactly the reason why we did both, because I felt there was an absence. I think Matthew's absolutely right. We are really visible. I can switch to my social media and my TV show, and we're there. But I felt a disconnect to other positive gay men locally to me. By locally, I mean in London, in the country, because there were less spaces for us to connect to, so support groups in the community, newly diagnosed workshops, peer support, all of those things which were, even the groups that GMFA used to run, those kind of spaces for us to connect were really important. And I felt it was a stepping stone to start rebuilding that, to start saying, actually, here we are, and we have features in there literally called Ordinary Guys, because I wanted to change that narrative that you had to be a celebrity, or you're just a regular guy who's a security guard in Tesco's and you happen to live with HIV. And I think that for me was a really powerful message. And that's what I hope to continue to do with the magazine.
I'm going to move on to the last question, and this is a question for you all, so I'll go to one by one. What does GMFA mean to you, and what do you think its lasting legacy will be? I'm going to go to Sean first. This one.
Wow. We haven't got all night because I could probably go on a lot about this, but it seems really strange, but I am so grateful for the opportunity that I had on so many different levels to be involved in this. I mean, it was a horrible catalyst, obviously, to getting involved in activism and community groups and everything. But, once we were in it, I learned so much. It really influenced how I thought about design, how I thought about communication, messaging, audiences, this idea that it was about direct communication. And in order to be able to do that effectively, you had to know your audience. What better way to know your audience than work with them to evolve the communication? So by working with experts, gay men themselves, who were the providers, but also the receivers of the information, I really learned so much. And it, you know, I've approached every design thing I've worked on since, I think, trying to think, who is that audience? What's their voice in this? What do they need to know? What's their opinion already? All of that stuff I got really from working in this kind of community-centered way with GMFA. And I'll always be really, really grateful for that, as well as the fact that I just met some really amazing people that I never would have met any other way. And so I think as a sort of legacy in terms of how the design evolved, I think it's had that influence, and it's something I take forward, and it's something I continue to teach in my other job.
Harry.
I mean, I think there's so much about GMFA that is now just kind of standard practice in health promotion, not just in HIV, but in all kind of health areas and across global health. The idea of a community-led response is absolutely, like, if you look at any WHO document around health, it talks about community-led responses. It talks about community health workers, you know, peer-led resources, all of these things. These are all things that GMFA pioneered, right, in the 30s. And those are still values that are absolutely at the center of the work that I do today in my current role. And I feel that I understand that fully and honestly because I worked within it, you know, in those kind of formative years. And I think the kind of honesty of GMFA, the kind of integrity of GMFA around, you know, not backing down from saying what is right or what needs to be said, definitely continue to influence the way that I work and the way that I create resources for the communities that I work with, and really just my entire compass on what, you know, health promotion and work in global health should really be. So I'm super grateful for all that. Plus, I had a bloody great time for 9 years, and we definitely enjoyed ourselves as well as worked really hard. So thank you all for that.
Nick.
I mean, Sean's talked about gratitude and community, and Harry's talked about the fun. And I think absolutely those, what it means for me personally is I have no idea what I'd be doing now if I hadn't just picked up a flyer for some GMFA things and turned up to a workshop, and then ended up running the workshop, and then ended up volunteering, and then ended up on the board, and then, you know, that wasn't my life plan. I think I'd have been doing something totally different, and I don't think I'd be so connected for that period of time, connected to my community, but sensing that strength in community. And now thinking, as Carrie's saying, thinking about the world differently, looking, you know, I'm sure a lot of us are involved, you know, look, when there was, you know, the COVID pandemic, looking and thinking, that's not how I would respond. What about the people who's affecting it most? Why aren't you targeting this properly? And I was putting my learnings from you know, 26 years ago back into, this is wrong, come on, to do this properly. So I think it really changed the way I operate, the way I think about communities and people, and yeah, that'll do.
Mark.
I mean, echoing everything everybody said, I mean, I have a personal legacy because, you know, GMFA was right next door to Big Up, and I would come and get a lot of mentoring and support from the team there. But Big Up was also set up because, you know, we needed to provide things that GMFA were not doing at the time, which is a different conversation. But it gave me my training wheels, and the legacy is to where I am today. And, you know, like Harry has said, you know, so many things that I learned during that period about being radical, about being unapologetic, being informed by research and evidence is stuff that I carry on into my practice. But there's something else. I want to name a person, which is Phil Samba, a young Black queer man who has been a PrEP champion for the past few years. And Phil came into what was the GMFA LGBT HERO, worked on the Me, Him, Us campaign. But because of the groundwork of foot soldiers like us years ago, we set this template for young queer activists today, like Phil, and a model of how they can work, how they can reach into and serve their community, which is ultimately what they want to do. But also using that real personal narrative. And reflecting what Nick said earlier on, this was about the people we were fucking with, the people we were loving, the people who were our friends. And when I see Phil doing that work in 2023, I'm like, okay, that DNA's continued. So that's great.
And Matthew, you have the final word.
I mean, everything that everyone has said, I think just, I guess, for me, it was very much about how GMFA put the people who were going to receive the intervention at the heart of the development of the intervention. And I think that was a vital lesson. But I think it's wider than that, because actually the participation of people with HIV and the way that people with HIV were active participants in the drug trials, which actually gave us effective treatment, which then also gave us PrEP, which also gave us the most effective prevention in terms of U equals U. We were active participants. And by that, we didn't just change the world of HIV, we changed the medical world. And not only did we change the medical world, but actually the activism that we saw, and GMFA was an example of this, it wasn't the only one, changed society. And if we look at where we are now with LGBTQ plus rights, it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the people coming together and saying our lives matter. And that's why GMFA matters.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we kind of finish up on the panel, does anybody want to say anything else? Are you all good?
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. GMFA has been such an important part of my life, and it's been a real pleasure to be a part of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all for taking part in this panel. Hope, maybe again in the future we might revisit this or do something else related to GMFA. But right now, thank you for your time this evening.